Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The new president-elect of the Republic of Korea, YoonSuk-yeol, has met with outgoing President Moon Jae-in for the first time since the election nearly 3 weeks ago. A planned meeting between the two earlier this month was cancelled due to differences on several issues. So what are the major differences between the two, facing social divisions like generation and gender? Will Yoon be able to unite the country? And how will his presidency affect relations with China, the US, and the Asia-Pacific region, for example? To find out, I'm joined by Jack Barton, correspondent in Seoul, Rong-in, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies, and Professor Robert Kelly at the Department of Political Science of Pusan National University, and Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney from East China Normal University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. We'll start with Jack. Jack, we know that there was a meeting between the president-elect and the outgoing president, So tell us, we talked about the differences between the two in terms of like a personnel appointment. How big an issue is that?
Yeah, that's not the only issue. There was supposed to be a meeting between President-elect Yoon and Moon Jae-in back on March 16, and it was called off on the day, which is unprecedented in South Korea. And it seems that Yoon and his group brought a number of issues. President Moon's group saying it was supposed to be more like a welcoming, a meet and greet, hints on the transition, tips on going forward in government. And instead, it looked more like a negotiation, and they needed to be more prepared if that was what it's going to be, a negotiation. Yoon's camp not really stepping away from that, saying, yes, they did have a number of key points. Now, one of them is the appointing of positions, government positions, by Moon Jae-in before he leaves office. There are a number of people that he could appoint, but the Yoon and his team saying they want to be part of that process, and Moon saying that's not going to happen. On top of that, there is Yoon's drive to move the presidential residence, the Blue House, Cheongwade. This is something that Moon Jae-in himself said he wanted to do. It was a presidential promise when he came to office. He didn't do it. Yoon now wants to do it. But Moon is now really stalling, saying there are security issues. They don't want to go forward, particularly with a time frame that Yoon has put down of moving in there on the 10th of next month. And on top of that, there's also presidential pardons. There is former conservative President Im Yong-bak, who Yoon would like to see pardoned, and he's offering something of an olive leaf, saying, why don't you pardon him, and at the same time pardon a prominent ruling party politician, a governor, Kim Kyol-soo, who was also doing jail time. And again, sort of Moon saying this wasn't what these meetings are all supposed to be about. So finally, they've managed to sit down and have some talks. They've made some headway, perhaps, on moving the presidential office. But still, there is this antagonism between both camps that we saw all through the election campaign. And everyone was hoping that when the election was over, this would go away. But it looks like, this kind of division, this polarization is set to continue.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jack, you mentioned about this antagonism. How will that, as well as the differences between the two sides, somehow, affect this transition, for example, for the new government?
It's going to be really difficult. Again, there's the appointments and the pardons, but then we come back to this moving the presidential office. This is something Yoon is really staking everything on. And he is saying that even if Moon gets in the way of this, even if the ruling party doesn't allow it to happen, he's still not going to move into Cheongwade, to the presidential office. He sees this as an imperial seat of power. It existed as a sort of a back garden area during the Joseon dynasty. It was the Governor General's residence during the Japanese occupation, and it's been the presidential office since the late 1940s here. But he says, it's too distant, not just from the people, but from all the government offices. He's isolated from his own departments, from his own ministerial staff. And so he wants to move down into Yongsan to where the defense ministry is. President Moon Jae-in saying, well, even though he wanted to do something similar originally. He's saying there are just too many security issues around it. And to be honest, the majority of South Koreans are against it. Polls show at least 58.1% are against it. And even if you put the margin of error in there, that's still a majority of South Koreans. So, you know, it's a really difficult environment. And in many ways, you could say the ruling party lost this election through a real estate corruption scandal more than Yoon won the election, you know, through a margin of 1%. So we do see a lot of polarization. We're going to see probably this continue for the next 5 years, unless there really is some sort of ground shift in Korean politics and society.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Jack, for the latest. Well, let's turn to our panel here. Robert, you are in South Korea. You know, Yoon, the president-elect, was a top prosecutor, and he never held an elected office. You know, one British newspaper called him like South Korea's Donald Trump. Is that a fair characterization?
No, I think he'll be significantly less clownish and sort of ridiculous and unpredictable than Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump was pretty unique. I mean, Yoon's got a sort of outsider mystique to him, right, that he wasn't in office, and I think, you know, in a lot of democracies, there's sort of a craving to have someone outside of the system with sort of anti-establishment character. My guess is that Yoon will play that up. But, I mean, he doesn't really have a great deal of experience, but I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing this sort of bizarre fight over the Blue House, as your correspondent just mentioned. I mean, this really is sort of, it is kind of out of the blue. I mean, it's been in the background for a while, but there's a lot of difficulty with it. There are a lot of sunk costs. There are a lot of, with staying with the Blue House, there are a lot of reasons why sort of, you know, South Korean life has configured itself around it. And this is a really odd issue with which to step forward. And I think that really sort of indicates the fact that he isn't very deeply rooted in the Conservative Party. He doesn't have a lot of sort of ideological convictions of a lot of the people who voted for him. You know, we'll have to see when it comes to things like taxes and education and real estate. North Korea, I mean, he sounds like a conservative, but it doesn't sound like sort of traditionalist figures that we saw in the past, like Park Geun-hye, Bak, who had much deeper roots in the South Korean right. So, I mean, he's kind of a wild card, you know, but I mean, we're in this time period in democracies now where we kind of like this. You know, we elect people like Trump and Berlusconi, and I guess you could say Yoon is sort of in that vein.
Yeah, Rong-Ying, you know, sitting in Beijing, you know, from Chinese perspective, you know, when you look at the president-elect, what's your response to him during the campaign? And of course, he's going to rule very soon.
Well, I think, of course, China, as a close neighbor of South Korea, is very much looking forward to working with whoever comes to power. And I mean, it's the President Xi, I think, has already made a phone call to the president-elect Yoon, which is, again, unprecedented. I think it is the first time for a Chinese president to make a call to a South Korean president-elect. And that was also on the taken place, happened after the congratulatory messages was delivered. That, I think, demonstrates that the Chinese side, Chinese government attach great importance to the incoming administration in South Korea. And of course, it is also because this year marks the 30th anniversary of the founding of diplomatic relations. And so, big year, new president, and a very uncertain and fluid situation in the region and beyond. So China looks forward to working closely with the new administration and in the hope that the relationship will be stabilized, the relationship will be improved, and the relationship will become stronger despite the differences and problems facing, I think, the new administration.
Focusing on his domestic issue, here, Professor Mahoney, you know, there's a pandemic ongoing in South Korea. There's a soaring housing prices, and of course, the unemployment issue. President-elect Yoon has basically, made pledges, including reversing the current housing policy, reducing real estate taxes, building new houses for the young, and allowing people to work 120 hours a week. How realistic is that? Will he realize that?
Well, we all know that the housing issue is the hot button issue. It's the scandal that likely brought him to power, and he certainly appealed to young people, young social conservatives, who like young people in America, are worried that they won't have the same economic success that their parents' generation had and their grandparents' generation had. But I'll discuss his 120-hour work week proposal a little bit more. And let's be clear, it would be a nightmare. There are only 168 hours in a week, so that would leave roughly 48 hours over 7 days for sleeping and eating and other essential non-work activities. As I understand it, the current legal work week in South Korea is 52 hours, though the national average is already almost 37, which is one of the highest among OECD countries. But he's romanticized the idea of young entrepreneurs, video game developers, and the like wanting to work more. But the real problem is whether or not more rank and file workers will have a choice and instead compelled by their employers to work well beyond human levels. As one critic put it during the campaign, even in the Nazi death camps, workers were only compelled to work 98 hours per week.
Mm-hmm. Not 120 hours, probably a little bit out of touch with the reality, let's say. So Robert, you were laughing at that.
Yeah.
Another big issue, obviously, is the gender issue. People call it gender division, gender conflict in this country. Some young male, like in their 20s, 60% of them, cast votes for the president-elect because of what they call like a reverse, discrimination, gender discrimination over there. But at the same time, we see that South Korea has probably the worst record in developed world in terms of women's rights. So what is going on here?
Yeah, that's actually an excellent question, which I think there's going to be a great wave of research on this, actually, sort of where this sort of came from just in the last like 10 months or something like that. But there has been, this sort of really pronounced backlash. There really is a very pronounced gender gap now in South Korean voting, particularly among younger voters. The split between sort of young female and young male voters was quite wide. Korea, I'd sort of like, as an outsider, my sense is that Korea is still very much sort of a traditional society, right? That Korea is only modernized in the last sort of generation or so. And I think there are a lot of sort of traditional habits that are sort of stuck, and there's a sort of inertia from Korea's sort of pre-modern sort of history, which was very long and really only just sort of resolved itself in the last 2 generations. And I think that is sort of hung over. But on the other hand, I think you have sort of a lot of young females. I see this at school. I see this in my university. You have a lot of young women who've been exposed through television, through travel, through their cell phones, with sort of a wider world where women can achieve and go off and build businesses and things like that. And I think those two things have really sort of collided. And I don't think, to be honest, I don't think the government here, again, in the time I've lived in Korea, I don't think the government's ever really made much of an effort to tackle this. And this is kind of festered below the surface. And as you said, it shows up all the time in these sort of UN gender scores, right? Whenever sort of you hear these sort of like UN gender equality sort of rankings, Korea always comes out sort of quite low. It comes out around sort of countries in the Persian Gulf, which I find actually kind of shocking that Korea would be that low. But I mean, this issue has never really been tackled, so far as I can see, by the government. It's never really been made a priority, and it sort of exploded in the last year. And I think Yoon is going to have to he's going to have to come around on there. So he's going to lose the South Korean conservatives will lose the female vote for decades if it looks like this sort of like vicious anti-feminist backlash, which is the way it looks online here. Most definitely. Mm-hmm.
Well, some say, they call it like, the South Korea is going to face a long, hard winter, long winter in terms of women's rights because of the new government upcoming. So, after all, we also need to keep in mind that in the parliament, the opposition, soon to be opposition, let's say, the party, they still hold the majority of seats. Is that going to happen? For example, one of the pledges like to abolish the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family.
Yeah, that's right. I think the big issue I think that the Koreans are looking at politically at the top in the next year to year and a half is for lack of a better, gridlock, right? I mean, South Korea is a presidential system, which means it's got a directly elected president and a directly elected legislature. And if the two go to different parties, you get sort of a collision of the two branches. And this is very common in democracy in Latin America. It's increasingly common in the United States. And I think that's what you're going to see in Korea. I think this president is going to have a lot of difficulty if he really pushes for a social conservative agenda, which it sounds like from the last few months, if he tries to do that, he'll run into a wall of opposition in Korea, and he'll run into an explosion in the newspapers, right? And so I actually don't think the gender ministry will be abolished. I don't think you'll actually see sort of an effort to get rid of sort of like placement quotas and stuff like that. That's just a bridge too far, and it would sort of pull Korea open and polarize Korea again on top of these other polarizations, political and age. I think it's just too much. It's just a bridge too far for the government. I'd be surprised if they try it.
Well, Rong-yin, another challenge, people would list for the upcoming new government is corruption. This country has, fought corruption for decades, and every president since 1987, when they leave the office, they will be sent to prison. Some others would, criticize the efforts against corruption, not the efforts, but the means. They say they focus on the individual perpetrators instead of the institutions, instead of the structures, which probably somehow encourage corruption, encourage duplicity, etc. What do you expect? President-elect Yoon also talked about fighting corruption. So, are we going to see similar things happen to the current administration?
Well, I only hope that this would not the fate that happened to all the previous president of South Korea would not happen to the current president, because it seems that there becomes some kind of a custom or tradition that the outgoing president would be prosecuted. I think even for the sake of anti-corruption, it does not works very well. And of course, I think corruption is something I think very much deep-rooted. And it is also to some extent related to the structure. And despite the fact that South Korea has been pursuing a sort of a democracy. Anti-corruption campaign, if it becomes a political revenge or the political sort of a move, it can be very counterproductive. So we'll just wait and see what would happen after the new administration, new government takes over.
Well, let's shift a little bit to the external relationship. We know that probably two pair of important relationship to South Korea, like big powers, let's say, neighboring China and also the United States, of course. One on economic relationship, one on the security issue. Professor Mahoney, so the current government has been pursuing a policy of equal importance to China and to the United States, because both nations are important to South Korea. But the candidate Yoon talked about strengthening relationship with the United States, with the Quad, probably do more thought system, the missile system. So what do you see the prospect of his foreign policy?
I'm not optimistic. As Robert was saying, he's probably going to run into a wall on his domestic agenda, especially the socially conservative issues. And so this means that he may end up doing like Trump did, and certainly like Biden has done, to pivot to international issues and to really try to find public support by exploiting the current anti-China feelings and sentiments in South Korea. So we've already heard that that Yoon is going to encourage expanding the THAAD system, and that he's going to encourage the Quad relationship. This is going to put considerable pressure on the China-Korea relationship, and it may end up putting considerable pressure on the South Korean economy if we see a return to Chinese economic sanctions, as we saw when that first came in. And that would really, of course, further inflame Korean sentiment against China, but it would also further imperil his economic agenda. And again, this is a show that we've already seen to some extent in the United States, which again, like South Korea, is suffering from this polarization and sort of superficial democracy that is waged over wedge issues and not a substantial ability to actually reform and move forward.
Rong-yin, from Chinese perspective, as you mentioned, President Xi Jinping made a phone call with President-elect Yoon, saying that China and South Korea are unmovable neighbors. I think what he's meant is like stability, a strong relationship between the two countries is in the interest of both sides. Trade, jobs, etc. Are good for both sides. So, what do you see the relationship between the two countries? Do you see probably a more divided region here, because obviously there's a pressure because of the, let's say, competition in Beijing and Washington, that has created some pressure on countries like South Korea.
Well, I think it is true. I think South Korea has been now under growing pressure because of the intensifying sort of rivalry and competition between China and the United States. But the point I don't make that South Korea does not have to be in such a kind of difficult situation where it would be forced or compelled to choose A over B. And I think I'm quite impressed by the statements, by the arguments that South Korea, this is of course the transition teams of the President-elect Yoon, that South Korea is now the ninth sort of largest economy in the world, and it is supposed to be to pursue a kind of independent policy, does not have to sort of live with to the fate that South Korea is being a sort of a stream between the two whales. So it all depends on, I think, what kind of a policy, what kind of positions, independent positions South Korea will be able to pursue. Whether it's going to be demonstrate kind of a strategic autonomy and taking into account its own interest. And of course, in this case, there are several issues. I think for China is very much important. Professor Mahundi talked about the question of Assad. I thought this issue has already been resolved by President Moon's administration, because as a commitment is made very clear to the Chinese side, the three no's. No deployment, no participation of the U.S. global sort of defense system, and not pursuing a kind of trilateral cooperation with Japan, the United States against China in militarily. So if things like that being handled properly, I don't see that the big issues. After all, I think for President-elect Yoon, the pressing issues, the pressing priority issue is the domestic politics, domestic issues, right? He won the election by a slight, I think the very small margin. And these issues, it would take up much energy. Yes. And supposed to spend his, I think the whole administration, foreign policies, I don't think it's going to make a huge...
that high on priority. But Rong-Yin, the latest what we have is the first day negotiation between Russia and Ukraine has finished in Istanbul, Turkey. Obviously, the Ukrainian crisis has a global impact. You see and ensuing sanctions from the West on Russia, somehow forcing other countries to choose side. Obviously, South Korea is on the side of the West, imposing some sanctions on Russia. But how do you see this crisis, creating kind of pressure that more or less you see the division in the region, right? Japan, South Korea joined Washington against Russia, but in the rest of Asian countries, basically China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, for example, they choose to stay neutral. Will that have an impact on their foreign relationship, on the foreign external affairs of this new government in South Korea?
Sure. I think in South Korea, the new government definitely would have to face up this reality, the pressure arising from this crisis in Ukraine. But again, as I said, that South Korea can demonstrate its sort of independence, strategic independence, in a way that it does not have to follow blindly. I think the fact that South Korea did impose sanctions on Russia because of the the need to in line with U.S. and others does not necessarily mean they have to follow blindly without taking into account its own interests. The Chinese side, I think, Foreign Minister Wang Yi made it very clear. Asian countries, developing countries, should not be compelled to take a side, to make a choice. Asia is not should not become a kind of a chessboard. And the Asian countries should not be pawn or players for that. And all the countries, every country should be able to allow to make decisions based on its understanding of its own interests. And that is the right way, I think, South Korea, the new government, should take.
Robert, what do you see as the foreign policy, might be foreign policy changes and a new government of Yoon?
Sure. I think the biggest thing is going to be a more hawkish approach towards North Korea. That's going to be the big switch. No more engagement, no more cover for the UN or for North Korea at the UN. Human rights will be taken more seriously. The South Koreans will support sanctions instead of waffling on them. I think that's going to be the really big switch. I think for the Chinese, what that's going to mean is the South Koreans will come back to China, as they did under Park Geun-hye, and ask for Chinese assistance to sort of rein in North Korea. I know a lot of Chinese don't believe it, but in the West and in South Korea, there's a lot of belief that China has a lot of impact on North Korean choices. And I know South Chinese scholars often contest that, but I think there will be sort of a return to Beijing and say, look, can you help us or not, right? And if China doesn't really sort of help, then increasingly South Korea is going to violate the three no's because they're going to feel like they're exposed to North Korean retaliation. The North Koreans are building lots and lots of missiles. They're going to build larger warheads, and at some point South Korea is going to need much better missile defense, and it may decide to build nuclear weapons of its own. And that, I think, is going to be the real switch, right? Moon didn't get a breakthrough with Kim. He didn't. Trump was too ridiculous. It just didn't happen, and so now it's going to be worse.
So that's basically probably a worse relationship in the Korean Peninsula between the two Koreas.
Yeah.
So, Professor Mahoney, do you see that? Is there any possibility, like like Trump at the very beginning, he talked about almost like a war with North Korea, but finally they had a summit, something unprecedented. Is there anything similar possible happen maybe in the Korean Peninsula?
After Trump, anything is possible, right? In the world of politics, and of course the comparison of Yoon to Trump is troubling. And if we want to look for some sort of strange silver lining, then maybe there could be negotiations. But as Robert pointed out, the negotiations between Trump and were really a sham, and didn't really amount to much, and probably did a lot to undercut Moon and his efforts to move forward. But I think one of the things that we've heard from Yoon is that that South Korea needs to learn lessons from Ukraine, and that you can't trust negotiations, that you can't trust paper and ink. And but my sense is that if there are lessons to learn from Ukraine, then here are two. First, getting into bed with the U.S. is dangerous. The U.S. has proven again and again that it's not a reliable ally, that it's a power in relative decline. And second, alienating the growing global power next door is also dangerous. And let's be clear, the previous conservative presidents in Korea and the U.S. did nothing but harm for their own countries and the world by picking fights when none were necessary. Furthermore, it's possible that the conflict in Ukraine has greatly weakened the Quad. Perhaps India will continue, but this seems less and less likely, especially as India sticks with Russia and improves ties with China, as we saw the foreign minister visiting New Delhi this past week. And I don't see the Quad really working without India. So if South Korea does move in this direction, it's showing up for an alliance that never got off the ground. And
we have to stop there, Professor. On that note, we concluded today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. You can find me on Twitter, Xu Qinduo, one word. Thanks for watching. See you next time.